Hi, I'm Jake Vossenkemper, Director of Agronomy and Research here at Liqui-Grow.
Hi, I'm Katie Hess, Director of Marketing and Sales here at Liqui-Grow. Dr. Jake, we finally got you to sit down long enough to do a fall research review. Although I've watched you drink a cup of coffee with sugar in it, and now you're having a Diet Coke, and I think you walked in with maybe a Mountain Dew in your hand, so it's going to be hard to get you to sit for very long, huh?
That's right. That's how late I stayed up last night working on this. I need all that caffeine to keep me going.
Right. Well, we appreciate that. Risking your own health for the
Yep.
sake of agronomy, right? So we're going to jump right into it. First thing we always like to do is review some of the products from the last few years, see where we're at, and then we've got some new stuff on the docket this year too. So should we jump right into it?
Yeah, absolutely, Katie. So this spring will be my 10th year here at Liqui-Grow, and the 10th season of doing research. And while there's way more things to talk about, way more findings to talk about than we have time today, I did want to review some of the key fundamental, important things that we've discovered over the last roughly 10 years.
And in the last 10 years, you have not had research sites in the exact same spot. I mean, regionally, you like to try to shoot for the same
Yes.
regions, but this last year in 24, where were your sites located?
In 24, the sites were located in near Aledo, Illinois, near Fulton, Illinois, and near Hampton, Iowa.
Okay.
And you're correct. I transition fields every single year because I want to sample different fields, different historical farming practices. You know, we're trying we're trying the best we can to work with, you know, the farmers and their management and our geography.
And you're trying to, simulate what
Yep.
we're already seeing out in the fields. Dr. Jake, if folks are interested in hosting one of your research farms, how do they reach out to you, or what do they do? Or what are you looking for in a field?
I'm looking for, of course, it doesn't have to be the highest yielding farm or the best spot in a field. It just has to be a uniform spot in a field, okay? Roughly 15 to 20 acres is what I would need to do my trial work. I'm looking for moderate on the lower end P&K levels, and that's because I'm doing a lot of soil fertility research. So if we don't have responsive sites to P&K, then all this research is a waste of time. I don't need extremely low levels, but I'd like something that would be likely responsive, like below 160 part per million in K and below 15 part per million in P. So
Okay.
that's the things that I have to have.
So if you have any interest in hosting one of Dr. Jake's research farms in the future, reach out to one of your agronomy field advisors, and they'll get in touch with Jake, and we
Yep,
can start that process.
absolutely.
Okay, so let's just start right away here with this fertilizer distance study. I know it's something you've been looking at over the last few years. But we're done with that study,
Yeah,
right?
we're done with that study, Katie. And so what this distance study taught us is that placing the nutrients as close to where the crop's going to be planted is important. And while that seems super simplistic, you know, it wasn't super clear either, right? So we did a study. There was a total of 10 locations, and it's absolutely obvious that to get the highest yield out of your fertilizer nutrients, you need to place it as close to the crop as you can.
So there's a few things that I think about, Jake. Technology has gotten a lot better and a lot crisper. And so we can get more accurate than we could 10, 15 years ago when we both started in this business. The second thing that I think about is when we're hungry, we go to the fridge, we go to the table, we go to the food. When the plants are hungry, they can go down, but they can only go about 7 or 8 inches out maximum on that corn plant. So having that nutrient placed close to the root zone is very important.
Yep, that's right. And you're absolutely right, Katie. I mean, you know, in pictures and things, we see this huge, expansive root system of corn. But the truth is, about 80% of the roots are in about a 6 by 6 by, I think it's a 6 by 6 inch box or an 8 by 8 inch box. Either way, most of the roots are pretty darn close to where the plant is.
We
So,
did that video too,
We
down
did.
close to Aledo, so we'll have Justin link that one in for us too. All right, so let's keep moving, right?
That's right. So another long-term study done starting in 2021, still going on today, but this is probably the last year for it, is my balanced nutrition study. And what this study taught us is that there is definitely synergism when you apply nutrients together. When you band nutrients together, you get a much higher yield than if you broadcast those same nutrients.
Okay, so we're gonna have to stop you for a second there. When you say synergistic approach to, co-applying nutrients, what you're kind of saying is by making sure every single one of those products is put in the tank together and goes on in the same row, you often see yield boosts.
You see a yield increase relative to broadcasting those nutrients
Ooh, I did it.
on the soil surface, or even incorporating it. There's synergism, I mean, and we can
So
get
why
in.
is that? It's Elite Academy. Go
Okay,
ahead,
all
get
right,
in the
all
weeds.
right. Well, there's a couple things that's going on. Number one, when you apply nitrogen with phosphorus, in short, simply, you increase the availability of the phosphorus. That's why MAP exists. That's why DAP exists. That's why 1034 exists. It's because we know there's synergism between nitrogen and phosphorus, and there's other Elite Academy videos that we can link where I go into extreme detail on exactly why that happens. Okay. The other thing that's going on is that when you apply ammonium thiosulfate, this is not going to happen with all sulfur sources. It's going to happen with ammonium thiosulfate or elemental sulfur. Those two, but not AMS, not gypsum, only ATS and elemental sulfur. Those products oxidize rapidly to sulfate sulfur, or ATS oxidizes really rapidly to sulfate sulfur. And what happens is the pH in that zone drops really rapidly, and that makes zinc much more available. So zinc is much more available at a pH of 4 than it is at a pH of 6.5 or 7, where most of the other nutrients are available, right? So dropping the pH in that band, we believe, makes the zinc fertilizer more available and or liberates zinc that's already in the soil and makes it much more available. Okay, that's the second thing that happens. The third thing that happens is we know that roots will proliferate or seek out or grow in much larger number in concentrated areas of both nitrogen and phosphorus.
Because it's an environment that they want to grow in.
It's an environment they want to grow in, and they're smart. They're scavenging patches of dense nutrients, right? Mm-hmm. They're investing in resources where those nutrients are. Now, we don't see that for potassium. Okay, when you apply potassium by itself in a band, we do not see that plants will invest more root resources into that potassium. But if you're applying the potassium with the nitrogen and the phosphorus, then the roots grow there because the nitrogen and phosphorus is there, and they automatically have to explore and take up more of that potassium.
Okay.
So those are the reasons why we see the synergism between those nutrients.
Got it. Now this is where people have been asking you, Jake, ExactStrips is great, but I like to incorporate tillage. So when should I be doing that tillage pass, right?
Yeah. So we're going to get there in a second, but this is now 12 locations, 22, 23, and 24. It's a lot of information and a lot of data. And so why I keep talking about the number of locations is you tend to see that once you get beyond 7 or 8, 9 locations, things really don't change. It starts to become pretty predictive of what you will see in the future, right? So 12 locations is a lot, and I don't expect this to change a lot more going forward. And that's why I kind of wrap studies up at about 10, 12 locations, because you just don't see changes after that, okay? So this is an update from what we've seen last year, for example. But again, we really haven't seen a lot of changes. What we have seen change a little bit is that in 22 and 23, we were pretty dry, right? So injecting nutrients into soils that tend to be more moist at 7, 8 inches deep increased yields a little bit more than banding these nutrients on top of the ground, which that's typically what we do with ExactStrip, right? Mm-hmm. But this year was a lot wetter, and we had a lot more surface soil moisture. And so we'd seen, last year in this data set that there was about a 2.5 bushel yield increase for injecting nutrients versus putting them on the top. But this year, it was a lot more moist. Generally speaking, we had about the same yield between injecting nutrients and putting nutrients on the soil surface, and that's why the yield gap between injection and ExactStrip is closed to about 1.5 bushels.
Okay.
So that's kind of the key point that I want to make about this slide. The other thing that is important about this slide is we're starting to ask questions about how does ExactStrip fit in with different tillage methods. And I don't have all those questions answered yet, but this is where we started.
I like how you say that. It was basically what we were talking about before we started this video.
That's
I
right.
was asking you questions.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And so what we see here is that the ExactStrip after strip till, or after tillage, you could say the same thing, is higher yielding than the ExactStrip before strip till, or you could also say before tillage. And so I think the thing to keep in mind here is that, we banded this fertilizer on the soil surface. We engaged it with the strip till knife. We engaged it with the cover boards. We engaged it with the rolling basket. And some of this fertilizer got moved with the residue cleaners.
And
right?
that's the 250.4.
And that's the 250.4. And that's obviously lower yielding than 255.2, right?
Well, you're going to move a little bit of that with your
Correct.
tillage pass.
And you're going to move it, and you're going to really incorporate it a lot with that knife, those cover boards. You're really mixing that stuff up, okay? And that was a little bit better than broadcast.
Right.
Also, right? So I think is what this says is that the more aggressively you distribute that band, the less yield increase you're going to get out of banding. And that goes right back to the synergism between those nutrients, right? When you really incorporate this band, then now these nutrients aren't interacting as close to one another, right?
So the injected 6 to 7 inches, just for the folks at home, the 256.9, that is a traditional strip till
That's a
method.
traditional strip till method, injecting it 6 to 7 inches deep with a strip till machine.
And so when you look at that compared to maybe the next two bars, you have to think about, okay, how many folks do I have working on my operation? How fast can I go? How fast can I get my acres done with a traditional strip till method? Whereas our ExactStrips is going to be a lot faster, doesn't require as much labor.
Absolutely, yeah. But you still almost get the same yield increase you would by injecting it. That's the key point.
So folks really need to sit down and weigh out what's best for their operation.
Yeah, right. If if a bushel and a half or 2 bushels is worth it to go ahead and strip till, then by all means. But if it's not, then we've got an answer to help you out.
Yeah, and talk to your agronomy field advisors on this data and all the other data as well. Okay, Jake, so my question really is if you're using an accelerator type tool or a disc ripper, maybe even a chisel plow still, how does that fit into this data?
Yeah, I think is what this data is starting to tell us. It's telling us a story about the less you mix these nutrients, the higher the yield's going to be. So if you're using an accelerator or a one-pass tool after this ExactStrip fertilizer is put on the ground, I think you're going to see something closer to that ExactStrip after strip till, that 255.2.
Sure.
If you're using a disc ripper or chisel plow or something really aggressive where there's lots and lots of mixing and incorporation, I think you're going to see something closer to the ExactStrip before strip tillage. So the less tillage, the more likely you're going to see close to that 255 point.
Which seems like common sense to me. The farther away you move the nutrients, the less available they are to the plants.
Absolutely, and that's what our distance study says. That's what all this information tells us, is that keeping those nutrients close to the crop is really important.
Here's one off the cuff for you. How about soybeans? I mean, everything we talk about here is with corn, with ExactStrips and your placement studies. How about soybeans?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have that info. I've started those studies a lot later than I started the corn studies, because corn is king. People tell me.
Right.
I love soybeans, but people tell me corn's king. So.
Right. It's fun to watch that gold corn roll into the grain.
Absolutely. Yeah. We haven't seen though so far that using this ExactStrip technology in soybean is nearly as beneficial as it is in corn.
Sure.
Okay. I think what's happening is we're seeing a little bit of injury from the potassium chloride, which is negating any of the benefits of the banding where the crop is being planted, right? So I'm going to go back to the drawing board, look at some different application methods for soybean using this technology. But as of today, I would say that we're probably seeing a little bit of injury from the chloride from concentrating it too much right where you're planting the crop.
Okay.
All right, so Katie, on this next slide, we're looking at basically different types of additives that you could put in furrow. And this was a long-running study from 2018 to 23, so lots and lots of data in this simple graph.
This is quite a title that you have put together.
Yeah, and Katie, I don't love doing this type of product evaluation research. It's not my favorite. It's not that interesting to me. It's not really very cognitively taxing. We're just looking at a bunch of products.
Yeah, but this is the stuff that we like to know, because we have to pay
Right.
for these products and we want to put them in the tank if
Right.
it's worth it.
Absolutely. And
we've been talking about either on-seed applications for corn or just like in-furrow stuff for the last 15 years.
Right.
And it's very hard to find something that is consistent.
Yes. Yes. And so even though these types of studies, these product evaluation studies aren't that interesting to me, they are very important to your point. And so what I think about is only 2 of these products out of these 15 are statistically significant, meaning that they're very consistent. That's what that means. Statistically significant means it happens a lot and it happens very often, meaning it's consistent, okay? And so the thing I think about, if I'm a farmer and I pick a random number from 1 to 15, what's the likelihood of me finding the best product of my own? Probably not all that high, right?
And I do think that's why a lot of farmers have shied away from these types of products, because they are just kind of picking one out of the grab bag, not seeing a ton of results, and saying, why did I waste my time and effort on that?
Absolutely.
And so then they go back to doing things the way they have been doing it.
Absolutely. And so, not that, in agronomy, crop production, nothing's guaranteed. And
Right.
I can't guarantee that Micro-AZ and Avail T5 are going to always increase yields on your operation. But what I can say is that I've narrowed down a whole bunch of products for you to focus on.
And you don't hear a lot about Micro-AZ or Avail T5 like on TV or in the news. They're not big, flashy companies that you just see, but their products are very consistent, and I've heard you talk about them a lot the last 5 years.
Yep. All right, so
what makes them?
Yeah, Micro-AZ is Azospirillum brellacense. It's a bacteria. It does a couple things. Most importantly, in my opinion, is it produces some plant growth regulators, the bacteria does, that then causes root hairs to grow in a lot more number. And root hairs actually make up the bulk of the root system. So when you think about more root hairs, you think about more water uptake, you think about more nitrogen uptake, more mineral nutrient uptake, the whole thing, right? So we know for a fact that that's what that bacteria does from lots of different university studies in this country and as well as in Brazil. It also is a nitrogen fixer, meaning that it takes atmospheric nitrogen and turns it into plant available nitrogen, but that's probably a reasonably small, insignificant amount of nitrogen. It might be 5, 10, maybe 15 pounds per acre. And I don't personally think that's the main driver of why it increases yield. I think it's the root number, increase in root hair number.
If folks look at your graph here, hopefully they can look past your team colors that I see you put together. But you'll see the 624-6, which is the starter carrier that we use. Do you have to have starter in order to make Micro-AZ work?
You do not have to have starter to make Micro-AZ work. In all these studies, I use starter as the carrier, but you would not have to.
Okay.
No. Micro-AZ has been very effective. It's been very profitable in my studies. It isn't an expensive product relative to In-Furrow products. I think it's great.
Yeah, so. And it doesn't really get tied up. We don't see a lot of issues with it.
Nope.
Okay.
All right, so the other product we briefly mentioned was Avail T5. And so on this figure, I have Avail T5 In-Furrow, which, again, I've looked at this product a lot, and we see on average a 4.5 bushel yield increase. I've also looked at it in suspension, and we see about a 4 bushel yield increase. And so to back up a second, what is Avail T5? Avail T5 is a phosphorus protectant product. It keeps the phosphorus more plant available. And so in environments where we would expect phosphorus to get tied up a lot more tightly would be environments like pHs over 7.3, pHs below 5.5, where you have a very low amount of phosphorus in the soil, where you're using low phosphorus fertilizer rates. In all those instances, you would want to make sure the phosphorus fertilizer you do apply remains highly available.
How about type of soil? Does sand, salt, or loam matter for phosphorus?
It's more about the soil pH than it is the soil texture.
Okay.
It depends a lot on the soil chemistry, and sands can have different soil chemistry, so it's not as tightly correlated to texture as it is to pH itself.
Okay.
And so, when I think about a product like Avail T5, you can look on this figure here, and this is all the yield increases at all the sites where I put it in with suspension. And you can see here that, at high pHs and at low pHs and at sites with low P levels, we get these large yield increases, right? And so we've actually developed a model, or precision ag prescription, where you can inject Avail T5 into the boom of a floater in areas where you have low P levels or really high and low pHs.
So we can get more specific about our placement on
Absolutely.
our Avail T5.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jake, if a farming operation doesn't have starter systems on their planters, a half a bushel you're showing, that's a good route to go with putting it on with the fertilizer then.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't have in-furrow capability on your corn planter, I think absolutely I would put it in with suspension. And I would personally use this variable rate application that we developed because I think that it's a lot more profitable.
Well, yeah, because you can be more specific.
Absolutely.
You don't just have to put it on.
You can put it where you know it's effective.
Yeah. So, Jake, we're going to have this question, so I'm just going to ask it. Would you put Avail T5 and Micro AZ in the same In-Furrow starter?
That's a great question. Probably not. If I had to pick between one of the two, I would go with Micro AZ. I just haven't done that work, and I don't know, so I'm not going to say.
Sure. So Avail T5 you could put on with the fertilizer, and then you could come back with Micro AZ and with the starter In-Furrow.
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
All right, Katie. So out with the old and in with the new. Now we're on to new updates, new trials from 2020.
And we can almost say that about the year. I mean, we're getting down there now.
That's right. That's right.
So all of this information is going to be super pertinent as people start making decisions for 2025, right?
Yep, absolutely. So for the last couple of years, I've been running a foliar applied product screening study in soybean at that post-emergence application time, so that V3, V4 time in soybean.
So what you're saying is second pass soybeans, and foliar means putting it in through the leaves, not through the ground.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So, number one, it's absolutely blows me away that you can put anything on a crop at V3 to V4 in soybean and get a yield increase.
Yeah, I know. They're like this big.
Yeah, absolutely. And soybeans really don't start determining much yield potential until R3, and we're a ways from R3 at this point. But that said, a couple products, we can talk about the
They're
top.
coming to get you, Jake. You hear that?
I hear it, yeah, probably.
Hopefully the folks at home can't hear all the sirens.
We can talk about the top four, but there's really two to me that have stood out, and that's, Crop Plus and then this polyamine pack. And, to your point, Katie, the yield increases aren't huge, but they're very consistent because they're just statistically significant.
Yeah, when Jake brought this information to me, he says, "What do you think about this?" I go, 2 bushel? I said, it's like watching fireworks, but they're like the town over. They're not like in the town that you're watching them in. So I understand that they're consistently showing yield responses and going to help us achieve that yield we're looking for. But, you have to kind of work through this a little bit. Yeah. As you're making your systems approach for your crop for 2025.
And I wish the yield increase was 5 or 6 bushels per acre. I'd love to report that to you. But
that's what's great about your yield data, though, Jake, and I trust a lot of what you say because it's not 5 bushels on everything.
Right.
You're very factual about what you're seeing in the field.
I absolutely try to be. And I'm going to call out polyamine pack here for 1 minute. You asked me to kind of dive into that data and cut it up and see if there was bigger responses here or there. And we really didn't see a correlation between yield environment or type of soil or whatever when I did that. But what I can say is that at all 6 sites where I tested that product, it increased yields at every single site, from 1 bushel to as much as 4.5 bushel at 2 different sites.
So what's in these products that are showing the yield responses?
All of these top products have, they all have amino acids in them. And I've talked a little bit about amino acids in the past, and there's a lot of research showing amino acids can be helpful for both corn and soybean. Tor sulfur has amino acids in it and a little bit of sulfur. B-Sure is essentially all amino acids. Crop Plus is amino acids, seaweed extract, and some micronutrients. Polyamine pack is amino acids and a whole bunch of different micronutrients. And I would say the main thing driving the yield with these products is the amino acids. I mean, the micronutrients might be bringing a little bit, but I've looked at a lot of foliar micronutrients in soybeans in the past, and particularly at that V3 to V4 timing, you just don't tend to see a lot out of a micronutrient pack at that timing. So I would say that it's the amino acids primarily that are driving the yield increases.
And the agronomy field advisors have all of this data with all the information on it. So if you'd like to learn more, be sure to talk to them as you're planning your 2025 crop inputs. All right, so we talked about soybeans, Jake. Let's talk about corn.
All right, so same principle here. This is a foliar applied screening study. The simple question is there anything I can throw in the tank at post-applied herbicide timing in corn and see a yield increase? And this is only 1 year data, only 3 locations. So, I'm not going to put my rubber stamp on this yet.
Okay, but this is the beginning.
But this is the beginning, and there were a couple products that really stood out. And 2 of them were actually statistically significant, and in my experience, to have 2 products that are really consistent over all 3 locations in 1 year is kind of rare. So Sulfur plus Enliven and then this Relief OS both really stood out in 2024. So if there's something you want to try at that post-herbicide application timing, broadcast with herbicide, of course, those 2 products will be at the top of my list.
What's really interesting to me, Jake, is that you used a lot of the same products in both trials with corn and beans, and you don't see the same results. So buying that one product for both crops is maybe not the way that folks should do things. Maybe we should be looking a little bit harder at what's in them and what do the crops really want and need.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm going to call out polyamine B, for example. It was, the third highest yielding in these trials. Polyamine B, just for example, didn't do all that great in soybeans,
right,
but it did pretty good in corn. I'll also say that, we talk a lot about boron, and boron's a little bit hard to nail down on when's the best timing and how much do you apply and so on and so forth. Polyamine B clearly has boron in it. It has amino acids and boron in it. And what we do know about boron is that we talk a lot about borons and high concentrations in the silks. Boron's needed at tasseling time in a high amount, and that's all true. But what the university data shows us is that V3 to V4 timing, foliar applied boron, that's kind of really where the sweet spot is and the most consistent spot is for boron. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's not why we're seeing pretty reasonably consistent yield increases with polyamine B.
To me, that makes total sense, because if you need the boron during tassel time to do the functions, you probably need it in the plant
before that. That's exactly correct.
You can't go
to
the party
correct.
with
Right.
the party.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's right. At VT, the silk's are already out. Everything's
Right.
happening where you needed the boron. So
Right.
you probably needed to have it on before that.
Right.
That's exactly right.
I always wondered about that, to be honest. Okay. All right, so next trial.
And the last thing I'll say is, again, it's really surprising to me that anything can increase corn yield at V3 to V4. Yes, we're starting to determine yield potential a little bit sooner than soybean, but still.
But the plants are so little, and there's
so
not
little.
much leaf area to take up.
And to be honest, that's right. Half of this stuff's hitting the ground. It truly is.
The rates that you look at, they're like 1 ounce or 3 ounces per acre. So it's crazy.
But sure enough, a couple of these products were very consistent in 24. Well, and I'll repeat this, probably the same exact products in 25, so we'll have a lot more data. And don't be surprised if these things jockey around a little bit. I
was just going to ask you that. How do folks get their products into your trial? Is it just ask first, get in first?
No. I would say that there's so many of these products out there. At first, I was kind of, just allowing anybody who was interested to get in these trials. But unless you have an already established business relationship with our organization, I'm probably going to say no, because I could line up 100 products to test, and it's just impossible. So unless I seek you out or you're doing a significant amount of business with us already, that's the 2 ways you would get in these trials. All right, Katie, so in 2024, we had a very wide range in yield levels in both corn and soybean, frankly.
Unbelievable yields in some places.
And disappointing yields in
unbelievable other places, yes.
Right, yeah. And my 3 sites actually depict that range in yield pretty well.
Yes, they do.
At Aledo and Fulton, Illinois, we had yields in the 300s. And at Hampton, unfortunately, we had yields closer to the 180s, 200s.
And to preface this, from January 1st to July 12th, Hampton had roughly 30.1 inches of rain, and then Aledo had 22.3, and DeWitt had 23.1. So, we're in that 22, 23 range versus 30 inches, and it's the story of too much and too little.
Right, absolutely. And so this gives us the opportunity to talk about nitrogen requirement and yield level, right? So there's this thought that high yield corn needs lots of nitrogen. So if you use the old rule of thumb, which I will say is old rule of thumb.
0.8 to 1.2.
If you use that thinking, then that means you would have needed 300 pounds of nitrogen to maximize yield at Aledo and Fulton. Mm-hmm. And what we actually see on these curves is that you only needed about 180 pounds of nitrogen to get 300 bushel corn. We actually got 300 bushel corn on 180 pounds of N at both Aledo and Fulton.
So I'm going to stop you there because you can debate this all day long. You can say, well, you have really good soils there, so that's why you didn't need the nitrogen. But my soils aren't as good, so I need more.
Interestingly
you hear
enough,
that a lot.
Yes, and interestingly enough, the soils at the Aledo location as good as you could imagine. Prairie soils, deep, silt loams, very good. Fulton was a lot more loamy and a little bit sandy, and you can see that at Fulton there was a lot higher response to N, but still, when we got to that 180, that's when yields plateaued. When we got to 180 pounds of N, that's when yields plateaued. So the Fulton location was a lot more responsive to N, but you still only needed 180 pounds because it had a lot lower organic matter, a little more loamy, a little more sandy.
The other conversation you can get into a lot is, well, if I don't put 250 units out there, or if I don't put this kind of rate out there, what could I be giving up if I go back to 180 or 200? I don't want to short myself.
Right. And I think, as we get in today and going forward, I think farmers are going to be incentivized to be as efficient as possible with the nitrogen. Okay. And that's where I think you have to say, okay, let's use a reasonable rate to begin with, and then if we need to, because of a wet year, let's go back and put on some more. I think that's probably where things are headed. The days of putting on 250 pounds of N and just saying, well, we got plenty out there, I'm thinking they're probably going to be coming to an end here in the not too distant future.
Jake, we did do that Lead Academy this last year on the Z70 credits.
45Z.
Yeah. Z71's a truck.
Yeah, the truck. Yeah,
my bad. Anyway.
Pretty popular truck, by the way.
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is, we already did that Lead Academy. You see some things coming down from the pipeline, from the government, and from just different offices. You're right. I think there's probably some stuff coming. Do we know what it is? No. But should we be prepared? And does data like this help support what we know we're going to have to probably follow for guidelines?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Katie, 100%.
Okay, so now that we got those questions and debates out of the way, why don't you go ahead and tell us what this data shows and what you think or want to guide farmers to for the future?
Yeah, so what I'd like to make sure farmers understand is you don't need 300 pounds of N to produce 300 bushels of corn. That's not the case. At Aledo and Fulton, you needed 0.6 pounds of N per bushel to maximize yield at those locations at 300 bushels. At Hampton, it was very wet, as you already suggested, and yields continued to increase even through 240 pounds of N per acre. Interestingly, at that site, what you would normally, and this is all corn soybean rotation, what you would normally apply up there, because the soils are so good and such high organic matter and they have the potential to mineralize lots of N, you would typically only need about 140 or 150 pounds of nitrogen following soybean up there. But last year, because it was so wet, you needed 240 pounds of N. And so what I think this really tells us is that, at Hampton, for example, it would have been really beneficial to go back and side dress, put on some more, because clearly you lost a lot because you had lots of weather. And it also tells us that sometimes low-yielding corn actually needs the most N because the crop had a hard time accessing the N because of poor rooting. The crop, you lost a lot of N because of too much rain. Sometimes the lowest yielding parts of a field actually need the most nitrogen because they're struggling for whatever reason. And the highest yielding parts of fields actually don't need as much nitrogen as you think.
Yeah, my heart really went out to those guys this last summer. We were up there a couple times for different things, and there were waterways where I've never seen waterways in fields up there just because they've had so much rain and ponding. And
yes, and absolutely. And I think this data also tells us what happened in some cases in 2024. We said that some guys are really disappointed, and I talked to several salesmen at the end of the season. We've got some fields that are yielding 270, 280, and then these farms that tend to be poorly drained, frankly, that the last couple of years, because it was dry, were the highest yielding. They were way off. What happened? Mm-hmm. It was nitrogen loss. And that's why we made those videos warning folks about if you had a lot of rain, you're going to lose nitrogen.
Right. We can link those in here below, too. Jake, so for a guy that, we're looking into 2025, we don't know what the weather pattern's going to be. We want to dip our toes into this new idea of maybe switching to 0.6 pounds or whatever, working off of our yield goals, as you suggest. How would you maybe kind of work that into your operation?
Well, I think baby steps, Katie. I mean, number one, I would point you to the maximum return to nitrogen calculator, and that's called the MRNT. And so, for example, at Aledo and Fulton, the MRNT calculator developed by Iowa State and other Midwestern universities would have said to apply 170 pounds of N. So pretty close to the 180 that we ended up needing, right? So that'd be a good place to start. Okay, I think start there. And then I think about, do I have an environment where I lose a lot of nitrogen? Do I have really poorly drained soils? Do I have really sandy soils? We're going to leach a lot. If that's the case, you probably need to use something higher than the MRT. But that's where I suggest you start, and then work with your agronomy field advisors, our team, to help feather that. Do I need to put on a little bit more than what that nitrogen rate calculator recommends? And that nitrogen rate calculator takes into account your geography, the price you think you're going to get for your corn, and how much you paid for your nitrogen, because it's really an economic question. That's really what it comes down to. How much N you should put on your corn is an economic question, and it's a risk avoidance question. And the risk comes down to how vulnerable am I in a given field to losing my nitrogen.
Well, and everything you just said there sums up why farming is such an art. You can't
Absolutely.
just go off the numbers, and you can't just go off the field.
And there is no model, I don't care whose it is or who developed it, that can answer all the questions. It takes good local knowledge and history of what's happening out there to make the best recommendation.
All right, cool. Anything else on the N rates?
How's a lot?
I know. Are you going to need another pop?
I think we're good.
Okay, In-Furrow starters. It's something we don't often talk about anymore. We've got so much data on this, but I know you're kind of bringing this back in.
Yeah, Katie, I was just telling a group on a conference call, I do starter trials every single growing season for our wholesale group, okay? So I have reams and reams and reams of starter information. This is one of 2 trials I did in 2024 on In-Furrow starters. We're always looking at, new additives, new formulations, changing up our In-Furrow starter offering or out-of-furrow starter offering. So this is just some trials I was running looking at different products. And I really just pulled some of the treatments out of a larger trial just to kind of talk about and look at. And so when I'm on the farm, I've heard farmers tell me, well, I've got good ground, I don't need starter. And this data suggests that might not actually be the case. So you can clearly see at both the Aledo and Fulton site, we had yields into the 300 bushels, right? And we still had really nice responses from starter. So you can see there that 624.6 at Aledo, for example, with no starter, the yield was 283. With 624.6, it was 306. And even just 1030 furrow increased yields at Aledo. Historically speaking, and a lot of data I have, products like 624.6, a balanced NPK starter is often, not always, but often better than just 1030 furrow. Okay, and this shows that in all 3 sites actually. But just because you have good ground and high yield potentials doesn't mean you don't need starter, and that's exactly what this data would tend to tell us. I think it really goes back to, at the same time, starter doesn't always increase yields and doesn't always pay, and my data shows that too. It's really about the environment that you're in.
Well, I was just going to say that, but I was waiting for you to stop talking.
Yeah.
I'm getting really good at that. I wait.
Yeah,
for
you are.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, the environment that we're putting this corn in. I mean, I see these planters rolling and guys are wearing their Carhartts. It's cold. I mean, starter's kind of a nice little blanket, right, for some of this seed.
Yeah, I mean, at Aledo, for example, the phosphorus levels, at Fulton, for example, the phosphorus levels of that field were really high. Mm-hmm. I mean, the residual fertility levels were 40, 50 part per million. And ain't no way you're going to get a starter response. But I was out there planting that location. I think we started on April 13th. I mean, it was cold, right?
That's my grandma's birthday. She said oftentimes there's been snowstorms on her birthday.
Absolutely. So in that environment, we had high P levels, but it was really cold. And when it's cold, roots don't move very fast, and phosphorus doesn't move toward the root very fast.
It's not available.
It's not available. So you have to put it close to the crop, and that's exactly what we see there. Aledo wasn't planted late. We started planting it at the very end of April, first week in May. But we were fighting dry soil. We were fighting wet soils at that site. So we had wet soils. Wet soils often mean cold soils. Well, guess what? Roots don't move very good in wet soils, and phosphorus doesn't move very good in wet, cold soils. So there you go. Hampton was planted at the end of May, but Hampton, we were fighting wet soils there. It was extremely wet, very, very, very challenging early growing conditions. No, so not surprising, we got a yield increase at Hampton, right? Okay, so it's really about the environment. So, and you don't know, right? You don't know. So when I talk about starter and think about starter, because we don't know, I think about it a lot like this. So if you were to sit down and do the math, let's say, instead of putting on 90 pounds of phosphorus in the fall, let's just say that's what you do, maybe you put on 70 pounds of phosphorus in the fall and you put the other 20 pounds in furrow. And if you do that, what I'm going to call an insurance policy against bad weather, really should only cost you $2, $3, $4 per acre. It's not going to cost you much at all. Then it comes down to, is it worth it for me?
When you say it's not going to cost you much at all, it's because you're reallocating your phosphorus dollars to a different application.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yes. And now it's about, is it worth me putting the stuff on my planter? That's what it becomes.
Right.
It's really not a cost thing too much. It's really, is it worth my time to do? And that's for you and your farming operation to decide. But the truth is, in some cases, you get a sizable yield increase from starter. In both Aledo and Fulton, it was over 10 bushels.
Sure.
And that would have made a difference in 2024. So yeah, that's starter. Facts.
And that's, when the emotions run high and you're thinking about all this stuff that has to happen, the facts and the numbers is what you have to kind of rely on.
That's exactly
so that's why we're
right.
here today.
Yep. All right, so Katie, almost done. So we're going to talk a little bit about sulfur in corn and soybeans now, frankly. We'll start with corn. So I have had very consistent, large, profitable yield increases in sulfur for a long time in my trial work.
Okay? The end.
Okay. This happens to be some trials from 23 and 24, okay? And so what I was looking at here is different rates of sulfur. We saw 11 bushel yield increase at these 4 locations from 15 pounds of sulfur. What about 30? Would 30 be better? It's a good question. And I haven't seen that. I mean, the question I get is, well, should we use more than 15 pounds of sulfur? And I haven't seen that in these trials. And so that's okay. We have sold a lot of sulfur. We continue to sell more sulfur because people are finding out that it's really important. Like I said, I had 11 bushel yield increase here. But we're about giving farmers the honest, most accurate advice to make sure they're as profitable as possible. And we don't necessarily see in a corn soybean rotation you need to go to 30 pounds per acre. Now, some other folks will recommend that, and that's partially why I've been doing this, but we do not see that, okay? What I would say is that in a corn soybean rotation, 15 pounds of sulfur per acre is still a good place to be. Continuous corn, I would increase that to 20 pounds per acre. Or if corn is following cereal rye. So even if it's rotated ground, if corn's following cereal rye, I would keep with that 20 pounds per acre. Treat it like it's corn on corn. I've done a lot of work with and without cereal rye, with and without sulfur, and we see a higher requirement for sulfur if corn follows cereal rye. Okay. Now, some exceptions to that 15 or 20 pound rate would be if you're in sandy soils or soils you would expect lots of leaching. I would say spring applications only, and I would say 25 pounds per acre. I often get really large yield increases from sulfur in these types of environments. 25 pounds of sulfur per acre, and I would split that between pre-plant and in season.
Okay, Jake, let's talk about sulfur on soybeans. That's more of a trendy topic these days.
All right, so I haven't done a lot of work for sulfur on soybeans. The universities are starting to do a lot. I'm kind of just getting into that. The napkin math would suggest that a lot of acres of soybeans need sulfur, meaning that if you look at if you look at a 70 bushel per acre soybean crop and what the soil can supply, the math would suggest the soil just can't supply enough sulfur to meet the needs of a 70 bushel per acre soybean crop. That's what I mean. Okay,
sure.
And we expect 70 bushels per acre, right?
Sure.
And so, based on that logic, I haven't done a lot of sulfur on soybean work, but since we got a lot of the questions answered in corn, we're going to soybean. And so we saw this year at Aledo and Hampton, we saw a couple bushel yield increase by applying 10 pounds of sulfur to soybean at Aledo, and the yield potential was in the 90s. And we saw an even larger yield increase at Hampton adding sulfur to soybean, more like a 4 bushel yield increase, but the yield levels were a lot lower. So at both sites, we saw a nice yield increase from sulfur on soybean. So I'll continue to do this, but in the initial years, we saw a nice yield increase to sulfur on soybean.
We've had the question multiple times already, so we might as well just get it out there. You see N and then you see N plus S, and the sulfur sources that we use have N in them. So we can't just pull out and just look at S, right? It's not practical for us to even research that because it's not what we're going to do. We're going to use ATS.
Right.
And you're doing this with the planter, but you can do it broadcast with the herbicides.
Correct. Yes. I did this as a starter application on the planter, but you absolutely can do it with your pre-emergent herbicide application.
But you cannot do ATS post-emerge.
No.
Not even like cracking or...
No. It'll really burn. It's a really
so don't do
bad foliar desiccant. Don't do it. Yeah. So it's more of an academic question because, like you say, practically speaking, you're getting some nitrogen with the sulfur, right? But this is actually a lot larger project with the University of Illinois, and so not at these two sites, but another site we had different tillage methods. So the bigger kind of academic question is, and maybe practical question is, if you're doing full width tillage, do you need sulfur? Because we know if you do lots of tillage, you warm the soil up faster, you're going to get more sulfur penalization.
And for most of our geography, we are not tilling in front of our soybeans.
We're not, but that question does come up from time to time. You're right. Like 80% of our soybeans in Iowa are no-tilled in a corn residue. Right. And so that treatment's in there also.
Right.
And we also have a treatment where we have no-till plus cereal rye. So in corn, we see a higher sulfur requirement if you plant cereal rye in front of corn. And we expect we might see that in soybeans too, which is why that's part of this study. And the other thing is, with no-tilling soybeans in corn residue, the soils are a lot colder. Would we get a yield increase from nitrogen? If you're planting cereal rye and you have corn residue, that's a colder, typically wetter environment. Would we see a yield increase from nitrogen in those environments? So it's part of the academic study. But practically speaking, you're right. We're getting the nitrogen with the sulfur.
So for 2025, are you going to have any sort of foliar sulfur products that you're going to be looking at in season?
Probably. No, I'm not going to focus on foliar sulfur products because sulfur, a 70 bushel soybean crop, I think requires 13 pounds of sulfur, I think, if I remember that right. You're not going to get 13 pounds of sulfur through the leaf area in soybean. It's just not a practical approach to getting a large quantity of sulfur to the soybean crop.
So having it up front is probably your best option.
Your best option is to absolutely have it up front. Whether that be in the fall, whether that be in the spring, your best option is to have it up front.
Okay, great. Well, that's pretty trendy and exciting.
Oh, yes.
What I really like about your research, though, is what the universities do, I understand, but what you're doing is practical to what farmers are doing every day. So you're mimicking like real operations and what they've got at their fingertips.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's what we really care about.
Yeah, absolutely. The academic questions are important, but the practical questions are just as important, if not more important.
Sure. So is that our last slide?
That's our last slide, Katie.
But there's
a lot more we could talk about. This stuff that I'm showing you folks, this stuff is stuff that I'm reasonably confident about. I've researched it for a while. I'm pretty darn certain that this is something that I need to share.
But we have a whole entire series of lead academies coming up this January and February 2025. And so we'll have a lot more of your research looked through and combed through by then. And we'll bring you more information then, right?
Yeah, and I would also say, Katie, there's lots of interesting stuff that I'm going to be starting to work on in 25. There's some soybean cyst nematode products that aren't yet EPA registered. I started looking at them in 24, had some really nice yield increases in soybean. We've seen some pretty nice yield increases with In-Furrow starter, right? Could we use our ExactStrip technology to put on a little bit of nitrogen in the spring and a little bit of P&K and simulate what we could get out of an In-Furrow starter? Those are things we're starting to look at. So that's the thing about research, and particularly in agronomy, because the environments are so different. There's many different farming operations. There's always questions to be answered. But we're going to continue looking at innovative ideas to help the farmer maximize profitability.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jake, for being here today, and thank you for taking the time to put all of this information together. You know, in a world where we can do a lot of research, we maybe sometimes don't always get the info to our agronomy field advisors. You take the time to do the work, get the information to the local agronomy field advisors, and then they can help farmers make decisions for 2025. So with that, I hope everybody has a great day, and thanks again, Dr. Jake.
Yeah, and no problem. Thank you, Katie. Thank you for all the farmers out there that do business with us. I'm happy to do it. That's what I love to do. So thank you.
Lead Academy.
Liqui-Grow
Excellent.
And agronomy
development.